My guest at this time is Andrew C. McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor. He is also a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online. He joins me today to offer his insights on last week's guilty pleas from former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort on charges unrelated to the campaign, but he is now fully cooperating with the Mueller investigation, and we want to know what that might actually mean and how it could possibly change the course of the investigation. And with all of the turmoil now surrounding the Supreme Court nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, we want to get Andy's legal and otherwise thoughts on that. So, Andy, thanks very much for your time today.
Greg, it's my pleasure.
Well, Paul Manafort was the guy the president was cheering for not caving, not folding. I don't remember exactly the terminology he used in that tweet, but he was convicted the same day that Michael Cohen pled out, so that's why he said that. But ultimately, when facing more charges, Paul Manafort did, in fact, cop a plea, and now he's cooperating with the prosecutor. As I mentioned earlier on, the charges he pled guilty to were unrelated, once again, to the Trump campaign. But what's the significance of Manafort now being a cooperator?
Well, I think, Greg, probably less than meets the eye. The guilty plea made sense for both sides because to the extent the idea of the prosecution of Manafort was to squeeze him into being cooperative, Mueller already had about 80 years of exposure based on that's jail exposure, based on the guilty verdicts and the 8 felony convictions in the jury trial in the Eastern District of Virginia. He really didn't need more out of the Washington trial. He had good reasons to want to avoid having. Manafort, of course, had good reasons to avoid that as well. So I think to try to dispose of the case without a trial makes sense. I think from the perspective of how you deal with cooperators, I don't agree with the way Mueller handled it because he's basically given Manafort the benefits of cooperation up front by giving him a 10-year cap on his total sentence in Washington and Virginia before the guy's done anything to earn it. So I think Mueller, yet again, has made life more difficult for prosecutors across the country by flouting the Justice Department's plea practice standards. But in terms of just doing away with the need to have the trial, I think it made sense for both sides. And as far as the cooperation is concerned, if Mueller had finished his prosecutions of Manafort and Manafort had not agreed to cooperate, Mueller could just have subpoenaed him into the grand jury and gotten him to testify anyway. So I think by doing it this way, from Manafort's standpoint, he at least stands to get some credit out of doing what he could have been coerced into doing in the first place, which is testifying. So, I don't think that means that there's any great shakes here. And not to go on a long soliloquy, I'm sorry about that. But, the other thing is, as I've been trying to explain to people or suggest to people for the last 7 months, Mueller has had Rick Gates, who is Manafort's partner, as a cooperator all that time. And it's unlikely to me that Manafort has anything on collusion with Russia that Gates wouldn't already know about. Seems to me that since Gates has been cooperating, far from ratcheting up a collusion case, what Mueller seems to have done is indict a pair of Russian cases, the troll farm case and the hacking case, in ways that indicate that there was no partnership between the Russians and any Americans, much less Americans connected with Trump's campaign. So I just don't think there's much of a collusion case there.
Well, there may not be a collusion case, but I'm sure some folks are going to look at that ratcheting down to the Manafort sentence. I mean, when the convictions came in, most of us thought he was probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison, especially if he had been convicted in D.C. as well. So now that he's handed the 10-year max sentence, at least some of the conventional wisdom is that he must be of some value to Mueller somewhere.
Yeah, well, what we've heard about Gates's cooperation is that he's been very helpful in connection with these Kremlin-backed Ukrainians that he and Manafort have been dealing with for years. I imagine that there's help that that Manafort can provide for them in that regard as well. I've always tried to give Special Counsel Mueller, even though I don't agree that he should have been appointed, I've always tried to give him the benefit of the doubt that he has taken seriously the original mandate that he had, which was not just to make criminal cases, but to get to the bottom of what happened in connection with Russia's interference in the election and what the prospective Russian threat is to our election system, and I guess whatever other institutions he can gather information about. I imagine that if he's taking that seriously, that counterintelligence overarching aspect of the investigation, Manafort's cooperation could be valuable. If you're looking at it, though, in terms of is he going to lend substantial assistance to the investigation or prosecution of other people, like President Trump, even though what I've just articulated is kind of the standard that you apply when you're dealing with cooperating witnesses who you're going to seek a sentencing break for. I'm not holding my breath waiting to see that happen. I just don't get the sense from everything we're seeing that there's a collusion case there.
Last question on this topic. We're now in between Labor Day and the midterm elections. Would you expect the investigation to be pretty darn quiet for the next 2 months?
I would. And that wouldn't mean, Greg, that nothing is happening. It would just mean that nothing public is happening. So I think that the Mueller people have always been very busy. You know, God knows there's enough of them. They have about 18 lawyers. And I imagine they'll continue working. The big thing that remains to be done, that at least that we all know about, is whether they get an interview with President Trump or not. Even though we can expect that we would hear about that eventually if it happens, that is the kind of thing that there's no reason that they couldn't do in this window before the midterm elections. I think, by the way, Greg, that whole thing has been very overstated. I mean, this is not one of those situations where you're concerned that a particular election is going to be swayed one way or the other by charges. This idea that you can't do anything in the window right before midterm elections because sweepingly this will affect whether one party or the other party controls Congress is a contortion of that doctrine, which I've never been too crazy about in the first place, but it's an extravagant extension of it that I've certainly never heard of before. The
biggest issue otherwise in the legal realm is certainly the twist in the confirmation fight over Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Seemed to get through the confirmation hearings largely unscathed. No one was really thinking he was going to not be confirmed. And now we got this cryptic letter from Dianne Feinstein, I believe it was last Thursday. And then Friday we got some more details about an anonymous allegation of a teenage Brett Kavanaugh sexually assaulting another teenager in Maryland back in the early 1980s. Then over the weekend, the Washington Post put a name to that story. A lot of folks saying, well, it's a serious allegation. It needs to be closely investigated by the committee. Others are saying, well, this is awfully convenient timing for this to pop up just before a confirmation vote. And there's nobody who can corroborate the story from the time. So what's your read on this and what it tells you about the process and what goes into confirming a nominee these days?
I think it's really a disgrace that this came out the way that it did, Greg. I mean, evidently, Senator Feinstein knew about this back in July, sat down and had face-to-face interviews with this guy, questioned him at a public hearing, questioned him at a private hearing. They never mentioned a word of it. And then, they spring this at the last minute at the moment that the guy is about to get a committee vote. I just really think the process is shameful. The whole idea that an unverifiable allegation that's over 30 years old that the woman apparently didn't even say a word about until about 6 years ago. This is something that apparently happened 36 years ago, if it happened. It's been denied by the only other two witnesses who haven't been shy about it. They vehemently denied it. That would be Kavanaugh and Mark Judge, the other person who was alleged to have been on hand. This is something the FBI is obviously never going to be able to get to the bottom of. If it were a crime, the statute of limitations would have run about 30 years ago. So I must say, just the way this was raised and the fact that it has the nomination in trouble is just going to confirm to people that no matter what you think of President Trump, and his way of doing things is certainly not my preferred way of doing things, he urges that you fight the way that the Democrats fight. You fight aggressively the way the Democrats fight. You break the rules if you have to, the way the Democrats do. And I hate the way or the thought that that's the way our politics are, but it sure looks to me like that's exactly the way they are.
Andy, we'll call it there for today. Thank you, sir, very much for your thoughts on both topics.
Thanks, Greg.
Andy McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor, now a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.